I found the key buried beneath fresh snow, half hidden where no one ever walked. It was warm in my hand, as if it hadn't been waiting long. That was the moment I realized the house had been keeping secrets from me. I moved into the old mountain house at the edge of winter, seeking quiet after a year that had taken more than it gave. The place belonged to my late uncle, a man of routines and silences, and it stood alone against the pines, wrapped in snow and memory. I told myself I was here to settle paperwork and leave, but houses like this don't let you leave unchanged. The snow was still falling when I noticed them. Not fresh flakes, those were gentle, almost polite. I mean the marks beneath them. Footprints, half buried. Careful, they curved along the back fence like someone had changed their mind mid-step. I stood there with my coat half zipped, breath fogging the air, trying to remember if I'd been outside the night before. I hadn't. The snow knew that. The house behind me was quiet, too quiet for morning. No hum from the heater yet. No bird sound, just a soft hush of snowfall. Like the world was being told to keep a secret. I went back inside for the shovel. It leaned where my uncle always kept it, by the mudroom door, same dents, same chipped handle. I remember thinking how strange it was using his things in a life he wasn't part of anymore. Outside again, I started clearing the narrow path toward the fence. The snow was heavier than it looked, wet and stubborn. Each push of the shovel scraped against the stone beneath, the sound sharp in the stillness. I followed the footprints without meaning to. They didn't lead anywhere. They just ended. My shovel struck something harder than rock. A flat, metallic sound, wrong for a yard that hadn't changed in decades. I knelt down, brushing snow aside with my glove. Cold seeped through the fabric almost immediately. There it was. A small key, dark with age, lying on its side like it had been placed there on purpose. I picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been. The kind of weight that makes you pause. Its teeth were worn smooth, as if it had been used often. Then not at all. No tag. No ribbon. No reason. I turned it over in my palm. The metal felt warmer than the air, and I didn't like that thought. Keys are meant to open things. This one had been hidden. I looked back at the house. Every window stared back at me, blank and unblinking. My uncle never mentioned a spare key. He never mentioned much of anything, really. The footprints were almost gone now, snow filling them in, softening their edges until they looked like accidents instead of choices. I wondered how long they'd been there before I noticed, and how many mornings I might have missed them altogether. I slipped the key into my coat pocket. The weight settled against my chest when I stood, like a reminder I hadn't asked for. The path was clear now, but the fence still felt far away, inside. The house creaked as I closed the door, not loud, just enough to let me know it had felt me leave and come back. I placed the shovel where I'd found it, hung my coat, stood still for a moment longer than necessary. Somewhere in that house, I realized a door existed that I didn't know about yet. And outside, beneath fresh snow, was proof that I hadn't been the only one listening. The heater clicked on and off like it couldn't make up its mind. Warm air came out, but it didn't stay. The cold lingered in corners, under tables, along the baseboards, as if the house remembered winters before electricity. I stood just inside the doorway, boots still on, listening. Houses make different sounds when they're empty. This one breathed slowly. Careful. I told myself it was normal. Old walls, old pipes. Grief makes you notice things you'd usually ignore. Still, I kept my coat on. I found the floor plan folded inside one of my uncle's notebooks, edges soft from being handled too many times. Every room measured, every wall noted. He liked order, liked knowing where things belonged. I started walking to the house, paper in hand. Living room, 2 doors, kitchen, 1 pantry, 1 back hall, bedroom, bathroom, closet. Each door opened easily. No resistance. No lock clicking. Open after years of neglect. Nothing hidden. The key sat heavy in my pocket, knocking gently against my ribs with every step. I tried not to think about it, Tried not to rush in the hallway. I stopped and counted again. Once with my eyes. Once with my finger following the lines on the paper. The numbers matched. They always did. Still, something felt unfinished, like a sentence that never reached its end. I opened the cabinets next, under the sink, above the stove, behind the coat rack, each one empty or already unlocked. No lock plates. No old keyholes filled with paint. I knelt to check drawers, wood scraped softly against wood. A tired sound. I imagined my uncle standing where I was, doing the same thing years ago, not looking for anything, just making sure it stayed put. The house felt colder the longer I searched, not sharper, not cruel, just distant. I leaned against the counter and took the key out, hold it up to the light coming through the window. It didn't shine, just absorbed the gray morning like it belonged to it. Keys don't lie. They're made for one thing, one door, one moment of opening. This one had been buried. I thought about the floor plan again. How precise it was, how careful he'd been, and how easy it would be to leave something out if you never wanted it found. I pressed my palm flat against the wall nearest the hallway. Cold. Then the next wall, same. When I knocked, the sound was solid. Certain, until it wasn't. One section answered back softer than the rest, not hollow exactly, just quieter. I didn't smile. I didn't feel fear yet either. Just settling in my chest, the kind that comes when a thought finishes itself. I slid the key back into my pocket and stepped away. Some doors, I realized, don't show themselves right away. They wait for you to stop pretending they aren't there. Behind me, the heater shut off again. The house went still. And for the first time, it felt like it was counting me back. The mailbox lid squealed when I pulled it open. A thin, tired sound. The kind that carries farther than it should in winter. The road was empty. No tire tracks. No wind strong enough to move the branches, just the sky hanging low. Pale and undecided, Mrs. Calder stood at the edge of her driveway, scarf pulled up to her eyes. She looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe the snow made everyone look that way. We nodded first. Neighbors always do. A quiet agreement to keep distance until words are necessary. Cold morning, she said. Her voice came out thin, like it had to pass through too much fabric. It is, I answered. I tucked the mail under my arm and waited. Sometimes people say more if you don't rush them. She asked how the house was settling, not how I was. The house. I told her it creaked at night, that the heater worked harder than it should, that it still smelled faintly of dust and pine cleaner. Normal things, safe things. She nodded, eyes on the ground, boot toe tracing a slow line in the snow. Then I mentioned the yard, the snow, something I'd found near the back fence. She stopped moving, her hand tightened on the scarf. Just for a second. Not fear. Recognition. What kind of thing? She asked, careful. Too careful. I didn't say much. Just that it was small, old, buried. Her eyes lifted then, but not to me. They went past my shoulder, toward the trees lining the property, dark shapes against white ground. Still. Watching. Oh, she said, a sound, not a word. For a moment, it felt like the world leaned in, the snow, the house behind me, even the mailbox stayed open, the metal lid trembling slightly in the cold. She smiled after that, polite. Practiced. The kind people learn when they've decided not to finish a thought. Well, she said, adjusting her scarf, this place has been quiet a long time. I waited. She didn't continue. We stood there with nothing between us but air and things unsaid. Her breath fogged, mine did too. Neither of us moved to leave. I thought about asking, about pushing gently, but something in her face told me not to. Some doors don't open from the outside. I should get inside. she said at last. Her voice had warmed back up. Conversation tone. Of course, I said. She turned, boots crunching softly as she walked away, didn't look back, didn't wave. I stood there longer than necessary, holding mail I didn't care about. The cold had worked its way through my gloves. I barely noticed. Back inside, the house felt different. Not louder, not darker, just aware. Mrs. Calder had almost said something. I could feel the shape of it, like a word caught behind teeth. And whatever it was, it didn't belong to the past. Outside, the trees didn't move. Inside, the key rested where I'd left it, between them. Something waited. The lamp cast a small, trembling circle on the floor. Everything outside it stayed dark. The kind of dark that doesn't rush away when you look at it. Midnight had already passed. I knew because the clock in the kitchen clicked louder at 12, like it wanted credit for keeping time. After that, the house settled into a different kind of quiet. The walls began to speak. Not in words, not in soft complaints. A stretch here, a sigh there. Would remembering it used to be trees. I lay in bed listening, counting each sound until they blurred together. Cold had crept under the blankets, thin and patient. I told myself this was normal. Old houses always sound alive at night. Then came the thud. Not loud, not sharp, just deliberate, like a door being closed by someone who didn't want to be heard. I sat up before I realized I'd moved, heart steady, breath shallow. The kind of stillness that feels practiced. I waited. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No second sound. The lamp switch was cool under my fingers when I turned it on. The light flickered once, then held. I stood, the floor cold against my bare feet. Boards creaking in protest. They sounded older at night. The hallway stretched longer than it had during the day. Shadows pulled where the light couldn't reach. Every door stood exactly as I'd left it, open, closed, unchanged. I checked the kitchen first. The clock glowed faintly. Hands frozen between minutes. The table sat in the center, bare except for the key. It caught the lamplight like it wanted attention. Metal warm in color, dark at the edges. Still, I didn't touch it. I moved room to room, slow and quiet. Bathroom mirror empty of surprises. Closet doors unmoved, windows tied against the cold. Nothing was wrong. That was the problem. I stood in the hallway again, listening. The house held its breath with me. Even the heater stayed silent, as if waiting its turn. I thought about the sound. How it hadn't echoed. How it hadn't startled the house into more noise. I'd felt finished, like the end of a small action, not the beginning of one. Back in the kitchen, I pulled a chair out and sat. The key lay between my hands now. I hadn't meant to put them there, up close. I could see scratches along its shaft, old ones, repeated ones, the marks of use, then disuse. I wondered how many nights it had spent in this house before I arrived, how many sounds it had heard that no one else did. The lamp hummed softly outside. Wind brushed against the siding, light and brief. The house creaked again, but not like before. This time, it sounded like acknowledgement. I left the lamp on when I went back to bed. Didn't close my door all the way. Some habits feel safer half finished. Sleep came slow, shallow, like it didn't want to stay. Just before my eyes closed, I heard it again. Not a thud, a shift, somewhere deeper in the house. I didn't get up this time. I lay still, staring into the dark, thinking about memories, how they move through places long after people leave, and how sometimes they knock not to scare you but to see if you're ready to listen. Dust lifted in the air each time I moved a box. It caught the light from the single bulb overhead, slow and patient, like it didn't mind being disturbed. The storage room smelled of cardboard and old paint, a place meant for things no one needed right away. I worked without thinking. Stacked boxes, folded tarps, swept the corners my uncle never reached anymore. The quiet help.it always does until it doesn't. My hand brushed the wall when I turned. The cold surprised me. Not sharp. Just wrong. I pressed my palm against it again. That section felt different from the rest, colder, smoother. The paneling there was newer, the grain lighter, the finish cleaner.it didn't belong. I stepped back and looked closer. The nails didn't match. Some were sunk deep, others barely held, placed by someone in a hurry or someone who didn't care if it looked right. The bulb hummed above me. I listened. The room had gone still. I knocked once with my knuckle, solid. Then a few inches to the side, same sound. Familiar. Safe. When I knocked again right at the center, the sound changed, duller, shorter, as if it had nowhere to go. My breath caught before I realized it had. I leaned in and pressed my ear against the wall. The wood felt colder there. Even through my sweater, I held my breath, listening for something I couldn't name. Nothing answered back. No movement. No air. Just a hush that felt intentional. I thought about the floor plan, about the way my uncle measured everything twice, about how some spaces don't show up on paper, no matter how careful you are. I ran my fingers along the seam where old paneling met. New paint had been layered over it more than once. Trying to make it disappear. It almost worked. I stepped away, heart steady but heavy. This wasn't panic. It was recognition. Someone had stood here before me, measured, decided, closed something off. I imagined the sound of a hammer late at night, quiet, controlled, each nail driven in with purpose. Not anger. That made it worse. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, emotionally. I turned off the bulb and stood in the dark for a moment. The wall vanished into shadow, but I could still feel it there, waiting. When I left the storage room, I didn't close the door all the way. Light spilled across the floor behind me, thin and careful. Back in the hallway, the house creaked softly, not in protest. In agreement. Whatever was behind that wall wasn't gone. It had just been given time. And time, I was learning, doesn't hide things forever. The screwdriver slipped once before it caught. Metal scraping softly against wood, a sound that felt louder than it was. I worked slowly, easing the paneling away inch by inch. Dust fell in thin lines, settling on my hands, my sleeves, the floor. The house stayed quiet while I did it. Too quiet. Like it was waiting to see what I would choose. Behind the last board, the space narrowed. Not a wall, a door. It stood there unfinished and unmarked. The wood darker than everything around it. No handle. No frame trim. Just a flat surface that didn't belong to any hallway. The lock sat at chest height, old iron, worn smooth at the edges, darkened by time and touch. It looked like it had been opened and closed enough to remember the shape of a hand. I didn't move right away. The air felt heavier in front of it, cooler somehow. I could hear my own breathing, steady but shallow. The key was in my pocket. It had been there all along, waiting. My fingers shook when I took it out. Not fear. Anticipation, the kind that comes before a truth you can't put back. I held the key up to the lock, half expecting it not to fit, hoping maybe. It slid in without resistance. Perfect. As if it had never left. The click was soft, almost polite. I kept my hand there, wrapped around the key, not turning it for a moment. I let myself imagine walking away, putting the paneling back, letting the door stay a rumor. Some rooms are forgotten for a reason. Some doors are closed to keep something in or out. I thought about my uncle, about the way he avoided certain topics, how his silences always felt deliberate. Heavy. The house creaked behind me, not in warning. In acknowledgement. I turned the key. The sound echoed more than it should have, metal against metal, final and clean. The door didn't open on its own. It waited. I placed my palm against the wood. Cold. Solid. Real. Whatever was on the other side had been given time. Years of it. I pulled the door open just enough to see darkness inside, thick and unmoving, a space that hadn't learned light yet. I didn't step through. Not then. I stood there with the door half open, heart steady, breath quiet, listening. The house around me felt different now. Less distant. More present. Some secrets don't resist being found. They just want to know who's standing there when the lock finally turns, and I realized, standing in that narrow space, that once a door like this is opened even slightly, it never truly closes again. The door opened without a sound, and no creak, and no protest, just a quiet shift, like it had been waiting for that exact moment. The air inside was colder. Not stale, not damp, just held still, as if it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. The light from the hallway barely reached past the threshold. It fell across the floor in a narrow strip, stopping short of the far wall. I didn't step in right away. I stood there, listening to the sound of my own breathing change. The room was small, smaller than I expected, bare. Except for a single wooden chair placed near the center, not tucked away, not pushed aside, positioned. The window behind it had been painted shut. Thick layers, uneven, careless at the edges. Someone hadn't wanted light getting through, or eyes getting out. Dust covered everything evenly. Undisturbed. No footprints. No signs of recent movement. And yet, the air felt used, lived in, like warmth had once gathered here and hadn't quite left. I stepped inside. The floor creaked softly beneath my weight, not old house noise, memory noise. Near the chair, I noticed the scratches, faint, almost polite. Thin lines worn into the floorboards, curved slightly, repeating in the same places. Something heavy had been moved. Over and over. Carefully. I crouched to look closer, ran my finger along one of the marks. The wood there was smoother than the rest, touched too many times. No photographs. Lined the walls. No boxes stacked in corners. No forgotten belongings waiting to be claimed. Not even a nail left behind. Just absence. I imagined someone sitting in that chair, hands folded, waiting, listening to the sounds of the house move without them. Morning passing. Then afternoon. Then night again. The painted window caught my eye. I pressed my palm against it. Cold. Sealed tight. No cracks. No effort to peek through. Whoever sat here wasn't meant to see outside, and no one outside was meant to see them. I stood slowly, the room feeling smaller as I did. The chair faced the wall, not the door. That felt intentional too. I thought about my uncle, about the way he avoided eye contact when certain names came up, how he changed subjects mid-sentence, how some silences feel heavier than words. This room wasn't forgotten. It was emptied. I stepped back toward the doorway. The light followed me, stretching across the floor, touching the chair for the first time in years. Dust shimmered briefly, then settled again. Before I closed the door, I looked back once more. The chair didn't move. The room didn't react. But it felt aware. I pulled the door shut gently. Not to hide it. Just to give it space. In the hallway, the house creaked softly, like it had been waiting for me to see that room, and as I stood there, hand still on the door, I realized the question wasn't who had been left alone in there. It was why no one had come back for them. The chair scraped softly when I moved it, not the harsh sound of furniture dragged across a floor, more like reluctance. As if it preferred to stay where it had always been. Dust lifted and settled again. The air changed when I bent down. Cooler, near the floor, quieter. That's when I saw them. Tucked beneath the chair, pushed back far enough to be missed unless you were looking. A bundle of letters tied together with twine. Yellowed and careful. Not hidden in panic. Hidden with intention. I sat on the floor to untie them. The twine resisted at first. Fibers stiff. With age, when it finally gave, It made a small sound, a sigh. Almost. The letters weren't signed. None of them. No dates either. Just pages folded again and again. Edges worn soft by hands that had waited too long. The first letter was gentle. Measured. It spoke of time passing slowly, of being told it was temporary, of trust. I understand, it said, in careful handwriting. This is for everyone's good. I turned the page. Then another. The handwriting changed gradually. Lines pressed harder into the paper. Words leaned forward, impatient. Questions appeared. Why so long? Why the silence? The room felt smaller as I read. The chair loomed above me now, legs planted like it had witnessed all of it. Later letters were shorter, angrier, less hopeful. I was promised. One said. The ink there was darker, heavier, like the pen had paused before finishing the sentence. And then my uncle's name, just once. It was written in the margin, smaller than the rest. As if added later, and then crossed out, not erased. Crossed out. I stopped breathing for a moment, not on purpose. My body just forgot. I could picture him then, standing in this room, listening, nodding, making promises he believed in at the time. The last letter was different. The handwriting had softened again, not calm, tired. I will wait, it said. No anger left, just acceptance. The kind that comes when you realize no one is coming back. I gathered the letters into a neat stack and held them to my chest. They were lighter than I expected. Paper doesn't weigh much, truth does. I looked around the room again. The chair, the painted window, the scratches on the floor. This wasn't a place someone passed through. It was a place someone stayed. I thought about my uncle's silence, how he avoided certain rooms and conversation, how he looked older than his years near the end. Some promises are easier to bury than keep. I tied the letters back together and placed them gently on the chair, not under it, on it. When I left the room, I didn't turn off the hallway light. I let it spill in through the crack beneath the door, because whoever wrote those letters had already waited long enough to be seen. The wind pushed against the porch roof. As I stepped up, letters clutched in my hands. Cold seeped through my coat sleeves. The mailbox squeaked in protest when I nudged it open. I felt the house behind me quiet itself, like it was listening. Mrs. Calder appeared at the doorway, scarf wrapped tightly around her face. Her eyes were shadowed, the way old people's eyes hold secrets even when the lips try to hide them. I hesitated, unsure how to begin. The letters felt heavier than they looked. I found something, I said softly. The words faltered before they reached her ears. She lifted a hand and sighed, long and slow, as if she'd been holding her breath for decades. I know, she said before I finished. Her voice carried something I couldn't name: relief, regret, warning. We sat at her small kitchen table. The kettle hummed quietly in the background, steam curled up, pale against the dim light, wrapping around the two of us like an invisible wall. I laid the letters on the table, careful not to disturb the twine more than necessary. This room, she began, her hands folded, belonged to your uncle's sister. She didn't look at me when she said it. Her eyes traced the counter's edge, as if the words themselves might escape her if she met my gaze. Someone the family chose not to remember. I nodded slowly. The letters now felt like a bridge between past and present, trembling beneath my fingers. Illness, she said, and shame, and fear. Her voice broke, just slightly, as if speaking aloud made the weight of it real. They sealed that door tighter than wood ever could. Her fingers traced an invisible line on the tabletop, following the edges of a life that had been erased. I swallowed, unsure if I wanted to hear more. Her hands shook as she reached for her mug, warm against her palms. The steam fogged the window, blotting out the view of trees outside. I can tell you this, she said finally. It wasn't just one person. Many of us, your uncle included. We all helped keep her hidden. The room felt smaller. Dust and steam and unspoken truths pressed in from the walls. I wondered how many mornings, how many nights, passed without anyone speaking her name. How many doors had been closed, locked, painted shut, not just in the house, but in memory. Her eyes flicked to the letters. Did she ever write to someone? I shook my head, only to herself, I admitted, voice low. Mrs. Calder nodded. Yes, she said, letters, the safest way to speak when the world isn't ready to listen. We sat in silence after that. The kettle stopped humming. The wind softened. Outside, a single branch scraped the siding, tentative and sure. Finally, she spoke again. She waited. She said, not for attention, not for forgiveness, just to be remembered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words, heavy as they were, hung between us. I left her house slowly, the letters back in my hands. Each step on the porch creaked softly. The cold air bit at my face, but I barely noticed. Somewhere between her house and mine, I realized the truth. Some stories live in rooms behind locked doors, and some live only in the hearts of those who remember. The wind shifted, carrying a quiet echo of her voice. I knew then that the room would never be just a room again, and that the questions it held, illness, shame, fear, silence, were not mine alone to answer. The paint on the window had hardened with years, thick and stubborn. I scraped gently, the blade catching and releasing tiny flakes. Each one fell quietly to the floor, like snow. Echoing snow, light struggled through the layers. Hesitant at first, teasing, I paused. The room smelled of old paint and dust, of waiting. The chair still stood in the center. Shadows clung to corners, tight and secretive. I ran my hand along the sill, fingers sticky with residue, and wondered how long it had been since anyone touched this wood. Outside, the snow lay heavy on the ground. Smooth and patient. It reflected light back toward the house, pale and steady. I worked slowly, aware of each scrape, each tiny sound. The walls felt different under the growing illumination, less oppressive, as if the room itself was exhaling after a long silence. The floorboards creaked faintly beneath my weight. Dust lifted in spirals around me. I imagined her then, the woman whose letters had never been signed, who had waited in this room without sunlight, who had watched the seasons shift through tiny cracks, never able to fully see them. The light grew stronger as the last layer of paint came away. Snow outside turned reflective silver across the floor and walls. I could see every scratch, every indentation, every imperfection. The room was smaller, yes, but it no longer felt heavy. It could finally breathe. I set the scraper down and ran my hand along the window frame, cold, sharp, alive. I imagined her sitting there, hands folded, eyes tracing the same patterns in the snow, not waiting for anyone, just being. The room had been silent for decades. Every creak, every breath of wind through the siding had gone unnoticed. Now, with light spilling in, it seemed to recognize itself. I could feel it in the way the shadows shifted. In the way the chair cast a single long line across the floor. I knelt briefly, brushing snow dust from the sill with my fingertips. It sparkled faintly, almost like acknowledgement. As if saying, yes, you are seen, you were here, your waiting mattered. I stood slowly. The room felt alive without being crowded. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed in this new light. Quiet, but different. I looked back at the chair. Could acknowledgement undo decades of silence? Could light finally let in, heal what had been hidden? I didn't know. I only knew that this moment, fragile and pale, was the closest I would come to giving her what had been denied. I left the room then, leaving the window open a crack to let more snowlight in. The hallway waited quietly. The house seemed to sigh behind me, and somewhere I felt the faintest sense that someone had finally been seen. Outside, the wind shifted, shadows lengthened, the snow continued to reflect light into that small room. and I knew, somehow, the silence would never be quite the same again. The snow fell softly outside, each flake folding into the last. The world beyond the window blurred into pale white. I stood in the small room one last time, the chair untouched, the walls catching the gentle light. The air smelled faintly of paint and dust, of waiting finally ending. I held the key in my hand, cold metal, smooth from years of hiding, heavy, though not in weight and meaning. I walked slowly to the windowsill. The sunlight, fractured through the snow and glass, caught the edges of the key. I placed it there carefully, letting it rest in the light for the first time in decades. I didn't lock the door, not because I had forgotten, but because some things shouldn't be closed. Not forever. The room seemed to exhale with me. Shadows shifted slightly across the floor, dust lifting briefly in the wake of movement. I ran my hand along the windowsill, feeling the cold seep into my skin. The snow outside covered the footprints I had made while exploring this house, each one erased, leaving only silence and reflection. Clean, quiet, necessary. I thought of her, the sister who had waited here unseen, the letters, the locked panels, the narrow door. She had been patient and now, finally, acknowledged. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but recognition, however late, carried enough weight. I glanced around the room once more. The scratches in the floor, the chair, the paint-stiff window, all pieces of a story no one else remembered. I imagined the seasons she must have watched through tiny cracks, how light must have shifted across her hands, across the empty chair, and I wondered if, in that observation, she had known someone would eventually see. The house behind me creaked softly, not in complaint, but in agreement. It had lived long with secrets and silence. Now it felt lighter, as if every hidden corner exhaled at once. I touched a doorframe gently before leaving, a silent promise passing between me and the house. Some doors, I realized, don't need to be closed to keep a secret, they only need to be seen. I stepped toward the hallway, snowlight spilling through the window across the floor. Each step made the floorboards hum softly. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, brushing against the siding. The footprints I had left outside, near the back fence, were gone beneath fresh snow. Nothing remained of my presence but a faint echo, a quiet acknowledgement. I paused at the threshold. Looking back, I felt the weight of this house settle differently. Not heavier, not haunted, but alive with stories no longer buried. The key rested there untouched, shining in its own quiet way. I left the house without locking the door behind me. Snow continued to fall, covering the world in pale light. I wondered how many other doors waited somewhere, still hidden, still telling their stories quietly to anyone willing to look. Some secrets, I realized, don't need hiding, they only need eyes to see them. And as I walked down the path, snow crunching softly beneath my boots, I felt the faintest sense that this house, with all its silences and hidden rooms, was finally at peace, for now, and that, perhaps, was enough.